Hey guys, I want to share with you in this video a few key points from Genesis chapter 1 that are really helpful to point out to somebody when you're reading this chapter with them and discipling them. The first thing I always like to point out to people from Genesis 1 is that God is all powerful. He's the source of all life. It stands out to me every time I read this chapter. It's like God is bursting with life. This is what he's like. So much so that he speaks and life explodes out of his mouth in the form of whatever he says. And not only that, it's like he creates the trees and he creates the flowers with seed in them to keep reproducing more life of the same kind. And I just see God, he's the source of all life. Everything that's living, it comes from him. He's the creator of all things. He's all powerful. He's majestic. I always like to make sure that people see that in Genesis 1. The second thing I like to point out about God is that God, I just see this every time I read Genesis, it seems like. God is a happy God that delights in his creation. Over and over, I think it's 7 different times in Genesis 1, God creates something, and then he goes, and it was good. And then he creates the next thing, and he says, and it was good. And he just keeps doing it. And then finally he finishes all of creation, and he looks at all of it together, and he goes, it is very good. And I just see God, I'd like to envision him when I read Genesis 1 as this brilliant inventor, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And they've had this dream that they've wanted to build, and finally the time comes when they can build it. And they get in their laboratory and they build phase 1, and they look at it, they're like, it's perfect. And I just imagine them high-fiving each other like, it's exactly like we talked about. Then they build phase 2, and they go, it's so good, it's just perfect. And they keep doing that, and they're so happy to be building this thing that they've been dreaming about. And finally they complete the whole project, and they look at it and they go, it's perfect. It is exactly like it's supposed to be. And it moves my heart to see that God is a happy God. He actually delights in not only people, but in the animals and the earth and the vegetation. Like, he loves it all. He delights in people. Therefore, that means he delights in me. So it makes me want to draw near to God. I just love gazing upon God's beauty in this way in Genesis chapter 1. So I like to make sure and point that out to people as well. The third thing that I like to point out from Genesis 1 is that there is one God. And I usually do this. Usually after we talk about Genesis 1, we work through those 4 discussion questions. At some point I say, hey, look at verse 26, the first half of it. Why don't you go ahead and read it? What does that tell us about the nature of God? And they read it, and it's interesting because it goes like this. Then God said, let us make man in our own image. And I always like to point out, like, if all we ever knew about God, if you never heard anything about him, you never read the Bible, anything, and all you knew is what you just read in Genesis 1, and that's all you had to go on to know who God is and what he's like, what would that verse tell you? And I think it's interesting because it tells us God is singular, yet there's more to it than that, yet plural. It says, then God said, singular, God is one, there's one God. But then it says, let us make man in our own image. And yet, there's more to it than that. There seems to be like he's one, yet there's more. And of course, we know as the Bible continues to go on that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So I always just like to point that out because right in Genesis 1, we start getting a sneak peek into the triune nature of the Godhead. Number 4, I always like to point this out, is that people were made in the image of God to govern the earth. And so I always want them to see that. People, human beings, God created them different from all the other animals and all the other things in creation. We were made in God's likeness. We're spiritual beings. We have a moral capacity. And we were created to be able to relate to God, to relate to one another, and to make moral choices. And God put human beings in charge to govern over the rest of natural creation. That's important to point out. And then finally, I always like to make sure that they see in Genesis 1 that everything that God made, it was perfect. There were no flaws. There was nothing negative whatsoever in Genesis 1. The earth and everything was perfect. God and his people, Adam and Eve, they were close together. Their relationship with each other was perfect. It's important to see that because that is God's intention for his creation.